highly distinguished speakers and participants of today's webinar on People, Planet, Prosperity, Rebuilding Differently. The Italian G20 Presidency of 2021 has decided to focus on three broad interconnected pillars of action: people, planet, prosperity, and it is intent on paving the way to rebuilding differently in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have the good fortune to have with us today several highly distinguished speakers, and I do not wish to keep you from what they have to say much longer. But before we begin the webinar proceedings, let me request our respected participants to kindly type in their questions along with the name of specific speakers whom they would like to respond in the chat section of Zoom or YouTube, wherever they have joined. So now let me now briefly introduce our first speaker, Dr. Deepak Mishra. Dr. Mishra is the Director and Chief Executive of the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, ICRIER. Prior to joining ICRIER, he was the practice manager at the World Bank's Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment Global Practice, responsible for East Asia and the Pacific region. He has held various positions at the World Bank, including the co-director of the World Development Report 2016 on digital dividends. He was also the country economist for Ethiopia, Pakistan, Sudan, and Vietnam. His research work has been published in various academic journals, including the Journal of Development Economics, the Journal of International Economics, and the Journal of Agricultural Economics. Dr. Mishra has also served as the World Bank's country economist for India based in New Delhi, and has worked closely with the Government of India as well as several state governments, including Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, Gujarat, Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Punjab. Prior to joining the World Bank, he worked at Tata Motors, Federal Reserve Board, and the University of Maryland. Born in Odisha, Dr. Mishra received his MA in Economics at the Delhi School of Economics and PhD in Economics from the University of Maryland. So Dr. Mishra requested to kindly deliver the welcome remarks.
Thank you, Ali. That was a long but helpful introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all, and a warm welcome to the webinar on Planet, People, and Prosperity Rebuilding Differently. This is the third and the final event under the ICRIER-KAS webinar series, COVID-19 Global Best Practices, Lessons for and from India. In collaboration with the India Office of KAS, ICRIER has been involved with research on G20 related issues for more than a decade. Our annual G20 International Conference for this year is scheduled to be held from October 6 to 8, and you'll all be warmly invited to participate in it and to enrich it with your deliberation. As Ali just mentioned, this year, the Italian presidency of the G20 has decided to focus on three broad interconnected pillars of action: people, planet, and prosperity. This underscores the intent of G20 members to pave the way to rebuild differently in the aftermath of the crisis for swift, sustained, and shared prosperity. The ongoing pandemic continues to cause dramatic loss of life and damage to the global economy. India too has suffered immensely. Many families have fallen into poverty, children have lost years of learning, thousands of enterprises face an existential threat, and workers in the informal economy have been severely affected. This crisis is setting back decades of development progress in many developing countries. Naturally, this unprecedented crisis is demanding more from G20 members, both at home as well as abroad. And they ought to do more because G20 members collectively constitute 80% of the global GDP, 75% global trade, and 60% of the world population. The pandemic has made it obvious the importance of international cooperation and the role that India can play in it. India has a consistent track record of commitment to work responsibly in concert with the international community and in conformity with established rules, norms, and principles of multilateralism. Therefore, the world at large is looking towards India as a compelling, credible, and trustworthy major power to play a strategic role in the post-COVID global recovery process. The discussion that we'll have today are of utmost significance, not only for the immediate term, but also for the long-term growth and development outlook of the planet. Your participation in today's deliberation would not only enrich the work that we are doing at ICRIER, but it will also help us to attract attention of relevant policymakers in India and abroad. To take our discussion forward, we have assembled a very distinguished panel of experts. So let me end my remarks by extending our sincere thanks to CAS for supporting this important event and introducing the next speaker, Mr. Peter Rimmele, who is the resident representative of CAS office in India. Peter has a distinguished career as a German civil servant. He has a first and a second law degree and a master's in geography. Peter worked as a jurist, judge, and lecturer before joining the State Ministry of the Interior in Saxony. He has served in various capacities in East Timor, Indonesia, Rwanda, and Lebanon. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Peter to you and to invite him to give his welcoming remarks. Thank you, and over to you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Deepak Mishra. Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome and thanks on behalf of CAS and ICRIER to all the distinguished speakers and participants of this ICRIER-KAS webinar, People, Planet, Prosperity, Rebuilding Differently. Dr. Mishra, thank you for your kind introduction. As he already said, this is the third and the last webinar in the ICRIER-KAS webinar series on COVID-19, Global Best Practices, Lessons for, and of course also from India, and will be followed by a publication of nations' case studies on the same lines. We have partnered with ICRIER for various research and discussions related to G20 issues, and we are pleased to be partner organization for this very important webinar series and this particular webinar, and it might be the last in this series, but I'm looking forward to our continued partnership. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to wax and wane as well as impact lives and livelihoods around the world. It has laid bare the systemic fragilities in our societies, or even failures, our global economic system and the frameworks that govern the international system. The consequences are clear. Inequalities are growing even wider, debt burdens are skyrocketing, and an ever-expanding number of families, communities, and economies require essential support. This unprecedented crisis has exacerbated the significance of the G20. It is an international forum which is best placed to play a leading role in enabling a global response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic, social, and environmental consequences. Because of the G20's global economic and political relevance, it has the potential to contribute to effective multilateral responses. The rapid development of COVID-19 vaccines has reminded us of the importance of multilateral cooperation between our nations. And I'll just give you a practical sample where there are some deficits. We know it's a global pandemic. We have different vaccines, and we're just planning to have an Indian delegation to Europe, different European countries. And although we have vaccine, we have vaccinated people, it's a matter of documentation, which vaccine has been used, allowed in what country, and is equal to what. So the global answer is still open, even if we have managed to vaccinate people, just as a practical sample where things have to be addressed. It has taught us that when we come together in new and creative collaborations, we can tackle challenges much more rapidly and effectively than we can our own, and we now also need to tackle the administrative challenges. The G20 has evolved into a crucial multilateral hub for global governance networks and is widely seen as playing an important role within the global governance system. Furthermore, the G20 has previously proven its effectiveness in mitigating the severity of the global financial crisis of 2008 and has gained, therefore, widespread reputation as an effective crisis management grouping. G20 needs to scale up its ambitions to deliver bolder messages and measures, enable developing countries in particular to address the crisis effectively. The COVID-19 crisis is setting back decades of progress in many developing countries. And that technical progress I would have to stop now too. It has set back the world in many points. And financing for sustainable development is off track to achieve the SDGs by 2030. To fill the gap, more public and private sustainable development finance is needed. Although measures to tackle the pandemic are most critical for every nation, currently, the G20 should take a comprehensive view of the challenges that the pandemic has spawned and best people, planet, and prosperity around the world more generally. The agenda of the Italian G20 presidency rests on the three main pillars. We need to take care of the people in our planet while ensuring a strong, inclusive, and sustainable economic recovery. I should stop here, and I will, to have the opportunity to listen to what our extremely distinguished speakers have to say about these pillars of the Italian G20 presidency, as well as present and future endeavors to rebuild differently in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, but not before concluding, ladies and gentlemen, with a quote from Robert F. Kennedy. "Tragedy is a tool for the living to gain wisdom, not a guide by which to live." Thank you very much. Without further delay, let me now pass on the baton on this webinar to Dr. Ali Mehdi, who will chair the thematic session of this webinar. Over to you, please.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Rimmele, as always, for a very inspiring, remarks and to share with us. Thank you so much. I'm honored to have the opportunity to chair the thematic session of today's webinar. Along with all the challenges that it has highlighted and intensified, the COVID-19 pandemic has also offered the opportunity to think and build differently going forward. So Dr. Mishra and Dr. Rimmele have already set the context of presentations in this session by four leading global experts. And so let me go ahead and invite Professor Anna-Katharina Hornidge to share her valuable insights on how development policy should tackle COVID-19, especially from the perspective of One Health. In their meeting last week, G20 health ministers highlighted the need to build a strong, transdisciplinary and holistic One Health approach to strengthen and support resilient and sustainable health, social protection and food systems, and to address risks emerging from the human-animal environment interface. Before I hand over the floor to Professor Hornidge, allow me to briefly introduce her to you. Professor Hornidge is the director of the German Development Institute, which in English is the acronym DIE, Professor for Global Sustainable Development at the University of Bonn, and a member of the German Advisory Council on Global Change. Since 2020, she is also a member of the German UNESCO Commission and that of several leading organizations in Germany and abroad. Previously, she was the department head and work group leader of Development and Knowledge Sociology at the Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research, ZMT, Professor for Social Sciences in the Marine Tropics at the University of Bremen, Department Lead, Political and Cultural Change, and Researcher and Research Coordinator, South and Central Asian Studies at the Center for Development Research, ZED. Over to you, Professor Hornidge.
Thank you, Dr. Mehdi. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's an honor to be with you here today. Thank you for inviting and putting an emphasis on this important topic. I would like to share insights from two avenues of discussion, to put it that way. One is the BMZ 2030 reform process. So that is a reform process that the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development of Germany has gone through over the last number of years, and it has resulted in more intensive strategizing, one could say, and the aim is to improve quality of development cooperation. And the second is to share insights on the discussion process that is taking place, fostered by the ministry together with vaccine producers, and my institute has engaged in this process and developed a number of recommendations for the medium and longer term building of the health sector capacities. And I hope that these two avenues and insights will just create a fruitful floor for us to then engage in a further discussion. So the reform process of the German Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development has had the aim to reduce the number of, or to focus the number of countries that Germany is engaging with through bilateral means of development cooperation, and identify or put an emphasis on particular number of 5 core topics and 10 themes that are called initiative themes where special initiative is being taken. It resulted in a document, and it was a bottom-up process actually that was initiated by, of course, the leadership of the ministry, but then drew on the capacities of mainly the younger staff in the ministry in order to see how the younger generations employed in the sector see and regard the future of the sector. It took into account that the surrounding of the sector of development policy and development cooperation has changed substantially over the past 60 years of when the ministry was founded, and looking into the future requires a number of restructuring processes. It resulted in the identification of 5 core topics. That's the safeguarding of peace, food nutrition, food security, education and sustainable growth, climate and energy, as well as environment and natural resources. And towards the end of the reform process, the pandemic hit. And of course, it became very clear that this nexus between environment and human health, as well as animal health, has to be taken up. And it had been ranked as one of the topics where the ministry takes initiative, but not as one of the core topics. It was then basically elevated to place more emphasis on it. The program also resulted in a further reduction, basically, of those countries that Germany is directly partnering with through bilateral mechanisms, as well as then the identification of global partners. And India, for instance, of course, is one of Germany's global partners. I think what is relevant here with regards to the environmental health nexus, or One Health as an overall theme, is exactly the point that originally health was not regarded as one of the core themes for the future. That is quite interesting. The risks of zoonoses, etc., of shifting climate regions, of newly emerging infectious diseases, etc., was not present, basically, to those initiating and those leading these discussion processes. And of course, we were in many ways corrected by the pandemic. Nevertheless, I would like to see this experience as symbolic in many ways for how much a nexus approach is indeed required. So what the ministry then did was to lift the global health topics onto the agenda, and linking it with biodiversity, with climate change, with natural resource degradation, with the building of social systems, social security systems. And I think that's actually at the heart of the One Health agenda, to reflect on how do we build the systems that enable societies to, on the one side, develop the early warning systems, but on the other side also develop the social security systems, including healthcare systems, to have the right triggers, to have the sensors out in order to foresee the linking of different crises that can be expected. So climatic, environmental, as well as social and political regime crises. Now, building, then of course the crisis, sort of the pandemic hit, and Germany as the second biggest bilateral donor released a larger Corona action program. But what is, of course, very relevant are now the activities that take place or do not take place, partly in order to create the systems for vaccinations to be rolled out, or not only rolled out, but also produced at a fast rate. And I think and that's sort of the second alleyway I would like to simply share is considerations of, on the one side, considerations of how to address the weaknesses in the science systems, basically, that are enabling us to prepare for future crises. Now it's a health crisis, but there will be others. And it has become very clear that it's actually the science system, and there is not one global science system, but it's very fragmented. We know that if you look at the funding rates of different nationally organized science systems, they vary from 0.1% of a GDP to 3.5 to even in Israel, even higher rates. And that's just the funding. We of course know that the valuing of more applied versus more basic research, different topics, different modes of knowledge production vary substantially. But the pandemic has shown to us that the continent that invests traditionally below average, basically, into building science systems, and that is Africa, is also the continent where 99% of the vaccines that are being used, and this does not just refer to the COVID-19 vaccines, but all vaccines are being imported. And of course, we are now in a situation where we are called to, on the one side, all globally jointly act on the short term, and that is about vaccine distribution. But I think it's important to use the momentum and also the political momentum in order to think ahead a bit. And there I would like to propose in the medium term to increase the supply of, on the medium term, of course, now increase the supply of vaccines by also establishing regional production centers, but often they will turn out to be fill and finish centers for now, but then also consolidate the demand by helping basically African or supporting African countries to coordinate their needs. And this is a process that is taking place now since quite a number of months, and then substantially invest into the science systems themselves to build up not only production centers, but also a network of scientific institutes, basically, that can in the different climatic zones, in the different also societal contexts, capture empirically not only the sort of signals for further diseases to unfold, but also develop the concepts for diffusion. We see with the vaccine at the moment, it's vaccine production is one thing, diffusion is another, and that is not only dependent on price. And actually that is the case anywhere. Also in Germany, we struggle with diffusion, and in many other countries. So what we propose is to use the CGIAR model, the model of the agricultural research institutes, and think about a network of pharmaceutically oriented research institutes, and research institutes that are indeed applied, research institutes that co-develop also basically the infrastructures for startups, for small enterprises that can then take or contribute to the actual production of vaccines. So invest into research and development, but not just somehow, but sort of around the model of, or using the model of the CGIAR centers. Then, of course, invest into the production, invest into the global monitoring of new variants of virus and bacteria-based diseases, invest into early warning systems, and early warning systems that do take care of the so-called last mile discussions. If we think of, for instance, the situation in Indonesia where the reaching of outer islands led to the death of over 100 support staff when organizing the last election, then we know that, of course, transporting vaccines that need to be cold, kept cooled, etc., is a completely different situation. Invest into the capacity building with national and regional disease control centers and health authorities. So to also develop the capacities for diffusion and provide services to national and regional health authorities and public institutions, such as, for instance, DNA sequencing of pathogens. So basically, what we suggest is to move out of the discourse where it's where we have sort of those who demand setting out of the intellectual property rights protection for a while against those who basically want to find different way, but rather foster a voluntary pool where companies can offer their capacities, their intellectual capacities for not just vaccine production, but also then vaccine development, but also for the production itself and for the diffusion, also all the different parts of the value chain, basically. These are sort of the two avenues I wanted to share with you. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Hornidge, for a very illuminating and enlightening presentation. Thanks a lot. Unfortunately, Dr. Ilona Kekbush will not be able to join us today due to a personal exigency. So I now have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Peter Taylor to share his insights with us. Dr. Taylor is the Director of Research at the Institute of Development Studies, IDS, in the United Kingdom. IDS has recently been ranked first in the world for development studies by the US University Rankings, as well as the world's top international development think tank by the University of Pennsylvania in its Global Go-To Think Tank Index. Dr. Taylor himself has more than 30 years of experience in international development. He was previously the Director of Strategic Development at the International Development Research Center, IDRC, in Canada, and has also worked previously at IDS as a research fellow, as well as an education technical advisor with the Swiss NGO Helvetas in Vietnam, and a lecturer in agricultural education at the Agricultural Extension and Rural Development Department at the University of Reading. So now I have the privilege to invite Dr. Taylor for his remarks. Over to you, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, and hello to everyone, and many thanks to ICRIER-KAS, and particularly to Dr. Ali Mehdi, a colleague and friend, for inviting me to participate in this event alongside such a distinguished panel. And it's really nice to be involved in this conversation with valued colleagues, and I've certainly appreciated all the remarks and reflections shared already in this webinar. The title of this webinar really has two main elements. First, it lists three areas which the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, have highlighted as central to our shared future: people, planet, and prosperity. And as inhabitants coexisting on this planet, it's clear that we all need to pay significant attention to the relationship between these interrelated areas if there's to be any real hope and optimism for a future that does not leave behind a very large percentage of the world's population. And secondly, the webinar highlights the notion of rebuilding differently. And that's a normative agenda for us to both imagine and deliver upon. In short, it's a vision of a different world. And just to say that, I'm very happy to see that this particular framing of rebuilding differently is being used rather than another quite high-profile mantra of building back better. And I'll say more on that in a few minutes. So today, this 15 minutes, I'd just like to say a little about each of these issues and also to make 5 suggestions that hopefully can help feed into this debate and also into wider ongoing deliberation, which I'm sure will be central to current and future G20 deliberations. And I'll draw on several broad strands of work which IDS, where I work, has been involved in during the last year. One's a close collaboration with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Government of Ireland, which led to a publication in January this year, which was actually called Building a Better World, the Crisis and Opportunity of COVID-19. And that was deliberately forward-looking, whilst also reflecting on lessons from the past. Another initiative which is funded by the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office of the UK, which is called the COVID Collective. And there we try to highlight the importance and value of social science research in addressing many of the biggest societal challenges arising from the pandemic, particularly relating to governance, social inclusion and development, conflict, and humanitarianism. And also a collaboration which I've been involved in this year with Dr. Ali Mehdi and other collaborators in developing a policy brief through the T20 regarding strengthening health system preparedness. And there will be publications already available and will be available relating to these. And if anyone's interested, I'd be happy to provide details afterwards. So I'd just like to reflect first on the dimensions of people, planet, and prosperity, which we know are central to the SDGs. These global challenges are affecting our planet and all life on that planet. And the COVID-19 pandemic is a prime example. It's affected everyone, everywhere, albeit in different ways. And we've seen how it's affected those who are already most marginalized and experiencing inequities and inequalities. And the measures taken by governments around the world to address COVID-19 are themselves having a major negative impact on those already in danger of being left behind. And this, of course, is set against a context where we're already seeing massive global disruptions and shocks in relation to the environment, economies, politics, societies, and technology. So in all of these areas, we see daily the sheer scale of the challenges before us, whether it's in the UK, in India, or really in every country of the world. But at the same time, we're observing a variety of efforts to try to counter these challenges. So very much in all our minds for more than a year, the COVID-19 pandemic is highlighting the world's vulnerability to epidemics and infectious diseases and the limited capacities for effective preparedness and response. The disease and subsequent public health measures are having dramatic impacts on livelihoods, economies, and societies, with negative effects on those who are already poor and marginalized. Yet at the same time, the crisis is catalyzing new local and global solidarities and fresh approaches to science and evidence and research. And these will be invaluable in responding to future health and other global challenges. Now, some would also argue that the changes to the climate and the environment are even greater challenges for people, planet, and prosperity, because they're placing unprecedented pressures on planetary life support systems, and they're creating new uncertainties in people's lives and livelihoods. And in responding and adapting to these uncertainties, we're also seeing concerted action at global, national, and local scales to try to transform the systems that create environmental vulnerabilities. And there are many efforts, and we'll hear many of these coming shortly at COP in Glasgow, which again is trying to address this most challenging area of climate change. These efforts are underway to recognize, scale, and replicate innovative ideas that communities themselves are identifying. Countries worldwide continue to deal with earlier financial shocks, and now from the COVID-19 crisis, and due to the increasingly unequal distribution of wealth and resources within and across borders. But in response to these shocks and inequalities, there are many enterprises, communities, and societies who are identifying new ways through which they can have a real stake and a voice in economic decisions. We also see that established orders of representative democracy face crisis, while space for civil society is closing in some parts and is changing in others, and not always in positive ways. The post-Second World War rules-based international order is being unsettled by rising nationalism and the emergence of new axes of power, such as those linked to China. Older norms, principles, and standards that have shaped, informed, and in some cases governed international development cooperation are changing and evolving. And at the same time, informal democratic innovations, popular actions, and protests around issues, including climate change and inequality, are multiplying. We also see that in many parts of the world, discrimination, exclusion, and marginalization are intensifying. And along with intersecting inequalities, these are undermining livelihoods, health, freedom of religion or belief, status, and dignity. and migration and displacement are affecting social cohesion. Despite this, we see many groups seeking to reclaim rights and justice, for example, the We Too and Black Lives Matter movements, and these are helping to imagine new and inclusive futures. And rapid developments in digital technologies have not been shared equally. These are being used in negative ways, sometimes to clamp down on citizen voice and protest. Notwithstanding, these advances are also opening access to health public services and are offering new solutions to societal challenges, such as strengthening democracy and accountability. So it's a mix, but there's a blend of what I feel sometimes is a gloomy picture for the world, but also many examples of possibility, of vision, of aspiration, and possibility. We know these are universal challenges affecting us all, and although their magnitude is often overwhelming, we see the efforts to tackle them are inspiring action. We're seeing global responses, global frameworks for action, for example, with the pandemic, with climate change. We're seeing rise in citizen action and the desire to hold governments and policymakers to account of their response as a counter to political tendencies that are more protectionist and populist, promoting short-term economic growth and often working against environmental agendas. We're also seeing movements on gender equality. It's often slow, but slower progress on diversity more widely. For example, the rights and well-being of people who are excluded or marginalized on grounds of sexual orientation, religion, ethnic origin, disability, or age. Now, each of these challenges are enormous in their own right, but they're also interconnected, and they can't be addressed in isolation. And at IDS, where I work, we're framing a lot of our work around what we call a politics of hope, aspirational and visionary, but also taking political economies and power as core to all our endeavors, so we can help identify what's possible in terms of more equitable and sustainable futures. We're having a lot of intense discussions currently about our understandings of development, about how we can decolonize our research and teaching, and how we can do all we can to reduce the extent to which inequitable structures and power asymmetries are maintained, reproduced, and recreated, both within our institute and in the external environment. So this feeds into the next part of the title for this webinar around rebuilding differently. At IDS, we've often referred that as building forward differently. And I'll just make a distinction between this idea and the catchphrase of building back better, which is becoming increasingly popular. I'd argue that the idea of building back better is quite problematic. We know it arose out of earlier efforts to address the shortcomings of reconstruction in the wake of major disasters, and that building back better could help ensure that houses, bridges, roads, and other infrastructure could be restored, but constructed in such a way that they'd be more resilient in the future. But the pandemic is a crisis of a different kind, and it's shining a spotlight, bringing into sharp relief a range of fissures, cracks, and marginalizations in societies throughout the world. And though it's still frequently characterized as a health crisis, the pandemic is, of course, multidimensional, and it's heightening fragilities, exacerbating inequalities, and it's deepening vulnerabilities in systems of all kinds. And as we just heard from the previous speaker, the signs that a pandemic was likely to arise was identified already, and unless major significant action is taken in the future, we will see other pandemics again arising. But at the core of the factors which have driven the rise of the impact of the pandemic, inequality has really been at the center of that. And the pandemic has stalled or even reversed important progress made in recent years. For example, gender equality and social protection provision. Those living in low and middle income countries are suffering the most, and they're also suffering differentially, whether because of gender, age, or poverty. And so it makes it very unlikely that we'll actually be able to achieve many of the SDGs. We also see that inequities play out in ways that, for example, those with the power or the means can draw on individual resources to ride out the pandemic, whereas those in vulnerable communities can't. We're seeing vaccine distribution and rollout being tainted by nationalism and protectionism. So what actions are needed? When it comes to knowledge and evidence, COVID-19 is going to require collective action and progressive leadership, including from the G20. And if transformation is going to be achieved, we'll need to do more than just a series of transitions that take us back collectively to where we were before. And funders, researchers, and practitioners alike will need to reposition themselves in response to the pandemic, focusing their efforts on building the resilience of both systems and communities if we're going to see genuinely transformational progress. So just quickly, I'd like to suggest 5 key actions, which I think are quite urgent, and hopefully will help guide actions to meet the needs of those who are most vulnerable and in the greatest danger of being left behind. And I hope they'll also feed into deliberations that I'm sure will be taking place when India hosts the G20 very soon. First, we need to challenge complacency, and we need to tackle tacit acceptance of inequalities, especially those that are less visible, and where voices of those who experience them remain largely unheard. In an effort to build back better, using that phrase, too many actors, particularly in the development arena, are trying to do what one person I heard described recently as doing the wrong things better. The last thing that millions of people around the world want is to go back to what was there before. And there's still a lack of awareness of the need for scale, collectiveness, and urgency. And there's resistance from those who have vested interests and who do not want to take serious decisions, even when the evidence is there. And this has major implications for the role of the G20, with India hosting soon and shaping the next round of dialogue. Second, I'd say we need a bold vision for fundamental, transformative, sustainable change. We need to move beyond the what is to the what if. This is only possible within systems that embrace democracy, transparency, the independent rule of law, and fundamental equalities, including gender equality. Because otherwise, building back better will just mean business as usual, and it will just perpetuate and potentially reinforce even more effectively the problems that were already there. And it's going to inhibit our collective ability to address other global issues like climate and health. We need to find ways to bring together those who are not at the table, those who are most at risk of being left behind, and use agency and voice as push factors to address the political economy, which often inhibits change. Third, we need to help people be better prepared for the future and for a different future. To be able to address new and different shocks, which are almost inevitable, we'll need to build slack into the systems and institutions, which can then be drawn upon in times of crisis. And this is something that we've talked about in the policy brief that will be coming out very soon through the T20, looking at how to strengthen the preparedness of health systems, and essentially how to enhance global health resilience through a range of measures that will actually help those systems and communities to be at the center of a strategy to leave no one behind. And that links very closely to the SDGs as a guiding star and a catalyzing force to help us do it. Fourthly, we can't do this alone or in isolation. We need to work together, we need to join up our efforts, and we need to collaborate if we're going to transform development, economies, communities, and people's lives. We need to break out of our bubbles and our echo chambers. And although the pandemic's presented many challenges for those working remotely, for example, this webinar is possible today because we now have these opportunities to interact in ways better than ever before. But it's also creating disconnects in some ways. Who is at the table? Who participates in these dialogues? It's providing useful opportunities for greater access to decision makers, and it also can help us collectively hold power and influence to provide alternative visions and ideas for the means of achieving those. And lastly, and just to conclude, to do all of this, we also need to look at ourselves. We need to be prepared to transform ourselves as individuals, to influence our organizations in positive ways, and to help transform the institutions that shape so much of our lives. We need to move from being observers to being players. And many, including on this webinar today, are stepping up to these challenges. But rebuilding differently, as the title suggests, is a long-term mission. It's going to need commitment, energy, resources, and a really joined-up collaborative effort if all of these aspirations are to become a reality. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Peter, for a very brilliant presentation, and always very inspiring to hear and listen to what you have to say. I mean, the very fact that, we had a pandemic of this proportion and the way it has disrupted our livelihoods and lives shows that things were not being done properly, and there were, major challenges. So, as Peter said, it cannot just be about building back better. We have to rethink differently and also rebuild differently. Unfortunately, although we have realized that the reality is very interconnected, the world is interconnected, but somehow, our academic circles, our thinking still remains quite, substantially not interlinked. So we do not tend to think in interconnected ways. We still lack a whole of society or a whole of government approach. So our governance systems, our academic systems still have to come to terms with the reality which the pandemic has thrown open to us very clearly. So, I mean, as the title suggests, rebuilding differently, it is not possible to rebuild differently unless we start thinking differently. And so this is, this webinar is, one opportunity where we are trying to make this sort of effort, and hopefully we'll carry this forward going ahead in terms of, bringing fresh ideas, to the table within India as well as abroad. Thank you once again, Peter, for your brilliant remarks. I now have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Matthew Bishop to share his insights with us. Dr. Bishop is a senior lecturer at the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. He rejoined the department in 2016, where he pursued all his degrees, a BA Honours in French and Politics in 2003, an MA in Research Methods and International Relations in 2004, and his PhD in 2008. In the interim, he spent 7 years at the University of West Indies and Trinidad and Tobago, firstly as a lecturer in International Relations, and then as a senior lecturer. Dr. Mishra has also held several visiting positions at the universities in UK, in Netherlands, and in China. He's also the founding managing editor of the Caribbean Journal of International Relations and Diplomacy, and has consulted for various organizations, including the erstwhile DFID, the Commonwealth Secretariat, and the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Bishop is also active within the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute, the SPERI, where he is a fellow and co-leader of its research program on development and the governance of a globalizing political economy. And he regularly writes commentaries for Explorer. So over to you, Dr. Mishra.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. Sorry, I arrived a bit late. I got confused on the time difference between the different places. So sorry about that. So I've been asked to speak about a project that was published earlier this year in the journal Globalizations. We did a special issue, myself and Tony Payne, who's now retired, who was the former director of SPERI and a professor at the University of Sheffield, where we try to look at how the world can essentially come in a more positive way out of the sort of traumatic decade or more that it's been in since the global financial crisis in 2008. As we were finishing this project, obviously the pandemic hit, and it suddenly became clear to us that our story, which was very much about rethinking globalization after the global financial crisis, had finally reached this kind of point where the sort of catharsis of the global financial crisis that had never really been resolved may actually be reaching its kind of endpoint. So we sort of started off by thinking about 2008, not as a discrete event that had occurred and ended, but it was something that had opened up and crystallized a fairly serious challenge for globalization. So we did this special issue for the journal Globalizations. I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about the final paper in the issue, but to kind of give some context, in the first paper, Tony and I kind of revisit the concept of globalization and develop this concept of re-globalization, which has appeared a little bit in some of the international finance media and spaces such as that. And we make this fairly simple argument, I think, and it's essentially that there's no kind of getting away from the fact that we live in a world that is globally ordered. We can't envisage any kind of progressive future that delegitimizes and tries to do away with globalization. We live in a world that is interconnected. We live in a world where people such as ourselves today enjoy speaking to each other across borders. We live in a world where people have relationships across borders. We live in a world where people migrate, so on and so forth. So what we try to do in that first paper is unpick the concept and revisit the concept to suggest that a lot of the opposition that we see in the world to contemporary forms of globalization are precisely that. It's opposition to a particular neoliberal variant of globalization that has emerged since the kind of 70s and 80s, which has been in profound crisis since 2008. So all of the pathologies associated with the most harsh forms of neoliberalism, so the kind of widening inequality that Peter was just talking about, environmental degradation, so on and so forth, are very much reflective of a particular kind of globalization rooted in a particular kind of time and space. And if we accept that idea, it then it implicitly or almost inevitably becomes possible to envision and think of other kinds of globalization that are not not neoliberal in quite that form. So we argue essentially that even if we don't necessarily see them in practice, in theory at least, there are different kinds of globalizations. We can envisage different forms of globalization. And in that paper, we go into quite a lot of detail, taking down what we call two different types of deglobalization. So there's the deglobalization from the right, which you might associate with the Trump regime, which is obviously no longer in power, but still very influential, I think, in parts of American politics. That kind of very right-wing, nationalistic, nativist form of kind of deglobalization, protecting borders in very, very exclusionary kinds of ways, so on and so forth. But also this kind of left-wing counterpart, which we've seen in Britain with parts of the Brexit movement, which exists in much of Europe and elsewhere, which seeks to deglobalize as well, in order to kind of protect workers and protect local industry and so on and so forth. We have a bit of sympathy for that view up to a point, but our argument is quite simple, that globalization in some form or another is going to continue. The kind of the underpinning processes associated with kind of economic integration and so on are so far advanced now that it's implausible to really envisage a wholesale winding back of the international order. And if that's the case, then you need to reinvigorate multilateralism in such a way that it can be governed in the interests of people and the environment, and so on and so forth. So what we try to do is set out what that would look like for us in theory. And we come up with this quite convoluted term where we describe it as re-embedded post-neoliberal re-globalization. And so we go into quite a lot of kind of theoretical discussion about what that looks like for us. And that concept does the job of underpinning the rest of the special issue of the journal. I won't say anything more about that first paper, but it's freely available online if you go to the Globalizations website, and it was also turned into a book as well. So following on from that, we have a series of papers by colleagues of ours around the world looking at the extent of global integration and the challenges faced by better governing that globalization in different areas of the global political economy. So we look at the IMF and international finance, we look at the World Trade Organization, we look at gender, particularly in trade, but the authors of that piece kind of look a bit more broadly. We look at migration, and so on and so forth. And all of those papers are concerned with thinking through what a better kind of post-neoliberal re-globalization would look like. So how can we think of ways to make it so that the WTO kind of emerges from the travails that it's faced over the last decade or so in order to engender a better form of re-globalized multilateral governance. Same when it comes to the global climate change regime and so on and so forth. We don't actually have a paper on health, unfortunately, because we commissioned all of these before the pandemic hit. And it would have been nice if we could have had one, but it was too late by the time that we finished it all off. And underpinning all of those papers really is a concern that we all had as academics with being, I suppose, a little bit bored of just writing very, very critical papers that discuss the problems that we all face. And we wanted to try and write things that for a change kind of lent towards solutions and suggested actually, how might these institutions or these areas of global governance actually be ameliorated? How can we try and overcome some of the political bottlenecks that exist to making things work better, which is something I think a lot of academics are not very comfortable with. I'm certainly not. I find it quite difficult to write those kinds of pieces of work without seeming a bit too utopian. So the paper that I was asked to speak on is the final paper where Tony and I come kind of full circle back to the kind of the arguments that are made in the paper. And we do three things in that paper. In the first one, we kind of just crystallize the insights of the special issue itself. But in doing that, we make a series of claims, which I'll briefly outline now before I move on. Essentially, we argue that firstly, kind of globalization, neoliberal globalization is reformable, it is possible and it is plausible. We can develop a different kind of globalization that differs to what we've had up until now. Secondly, we suggest that the major kind of tipping point that we face as a society, quite apart from kind of the environmental limits that we seem to be reaching in terms of current forms of growth, are the levels of inequality today between and within societies are becoming extremely damaging. That kind of grotesque level of inequality is extremely damaging, and it's that level of inequality which is almost generating the sustained opposition to kind of open, broadly liberal forms of globalization, which threaten to almost throw that kind of baby out with the bathwater, that could lead to a kind of undermining of all of the good things that come with globalization. And this takes us back, I think, to our kind of earlier argument that, you know, the problems we have are not necessarily of global integration itself, they're of the form of global integration we've had over the last few decades. Following on from that, another point we make is that all of this doesn't mean that we should make the world any less global. What we should do is make globalization work better, and in particular, the kind of argument that Danny Roderick has made in recent years. You know, it's much. You know, you need to compensate the winners and losers of compensate the losers of global integration better than you do at present, because there have been fairly painful distributional consequences for those that have been left out of that level of progress. We see this just as much in ostensibly developed countries like Britain as we do in poorer parts of the world, or nominally poorer parts of the world. We suggest also that part of the problem we have presently is that we don't have a social purpose underpinning globalization. So if you think about the way, I work a lot on trade politics, I have done historically, and if you think about the way, one of the kind of fundamental problems as I see it with WTO is that it doesn't have much of a social purpose. What we've had for the last 30 years or so is liberalization for liberalization's sake, rather than liberalization in a controlled fashion in order to serve developmental objectives. So that kind of social purpose is missing more broadly, and we need to think as a kind of society as to what that social purpose might be. And then finally, a kind of final point we make is that our kind of the extent of global governance we have is both partial and in some cases even non-existent. So in many issue areas, migration is the one we discuss in detail in the special issue, but in a whole manner of different other areas, the kind of migration going all the way down from kind of fairly regular forms of migration down to kind of human trafficking and very clandestine forms of migration is one area. But you know, the instability in the food system globally, which is obviously a big issue for India, that is barely governed at all by kind of serious multilateral action. All manner of different things to do with kind of criminality and drug trafficking, which is something I'm working on quite a lot at the moment. So on and so forth, all manner of different areas of globalization, big data being another one, and not governed adequately. And this kind of fragmented nature of global governance leads to fragility, and it leads to huge amounts of instability. So that's our kind of overarching sort of underpinning argument. And we suggest that, well, the G20 really is the institution which needs to be reformed first in order to bring some kind of order to all of this. So I think if I take a step back and think sort of morally, I think there are fairly serious problems with the G20 in the sense of the fact that it's, you know, it's pretty exclusionary. It excludes the vast majority of the world's countries, particularly smaller countries. It has fairly serious problems in terms of the way it was kind of institutionalized and embedded. But at the same time, the G20 also has a comparative advantage that no other organization has, which is that it is reasonably representative in the sense that it brings together the most powerful countries and institutions and organizations in a discussion forum, and it's fairly unique for that. And at the same time, the G20 also has a kind of institutional paraphernalia that has begun to develop, but has almost also kind of stopped developing, but could be developed in better ways. So we suggest essentially that the G20 needs 3 broad reforms in order to drive forward the next stage of globalization. And we base this on an analysis where we do talk quite a lot about the COVID pandemic. As we were finishing this paper, we included a section in the paper about the pandemic where we essentially argue that this episode is the thing that closes off the crisis of 2008. And we suggest that it's quite plausible that in the future historians will look back on this period as not being 2 separate crises, but as twin crises where the very big problems that became evident throughout the 2010s, so the rise of big data being one, and the control of kind of platform monopolies, intensified, accelerated environmental degradation, even worse inequality than even existed before 2008. I mean, there's been an explosion of exclusion really since 2008, in particular in Western countries. When you think about people that are squeezed out of any kind of asset ownership, you know, young people in Britain, young highly educated graduates in Britain, completely shut out of having any hope of even owning a home as they grow up, and so on. So these kind of morbid symptoms, as Gramsci would call them, that have become very evident over the last decade or so, the kind of things that Thomas Piketty and others have written about. We suggest that 2008 to 2021 will be looked at as a single crisis almost, and whatever happens after 2021 will be in some way or another, hopefully, the turning point where we could envisage and implement a new kind of globalization. Although we don't seem to have it yet, I mean, in some respects, Biden has been probably more isolationist than many will have expected after the Trump period. It seems to me that at the very least, the social conditions are potentially in place now. They will be going forward. And again, in exactly the way Peter said, you know, people don't want to go back to what happened before. So after 2008, there was a lot of hope for a kind of Bretton Woods 2, where we established an entirely new kind of institutional order that was akin to 1945, but the social kind of context just wasn't there. It just couldn't happen in the way that it did in 1945. My feeling is that after 2021, things are becoming so bad that we may have that kind of groundswell that sees a kind of emergence of a politics that moves towards that. When I speak to my young students today, I'm always astonished by how much more radical they are than I am. You know, they're not prepared to accept a world where they have to inherit a fairly awful settlement, particularly in terms of climate, but also in terms of their economic relations. Anyway, so we base our analysis of the G20 on that kind of contextual situation. And we make 3 fairly simple but fairly broad claims. And the first one is that the G20 really is the only institution that can do a very particular job to do with global governance. And that is effectively its kind of coordinating function, right? That's the G20's real comparative advantage. It can bring together the leaders of the most systemically important countries, along with the EU and the IMF, etc., and bring them together in a space where they can make the major decisions to kind of coordinate international relations, or at least international economic relations, in quite an effective way. But the problem is that there's been this sort of tension at the heart of the G20's sort of mission. On the one hand, it has almost become that premier forum for international economic cooperation, which is how it described itself in Pittsburgh in 2009 after the global financial crisis. But on the other hand, and I think if you spend time at G20s, I've spent quite a lot of time in the media centre at a few G20 meetings in recent years. It also seems to be kind of just like a jamboree, at least the summit does, a jamboree where you've got a wider range of countries participating than in the past, but these kind of everyday sort of nonsense politics just take over. So there was quite a circus around Trump, and Trump was US president, that kind of derailed certain meetings. And so there's a real problem. On the one hand, you've got this potential really useful, good meeting that occurs. On the other, it often gets subsumed to the kind of everyday political controversy of the time. Now, obviously, there's a huge amount of work going on underneath the surface with the T20 and all of the other kind of working committees and groups that are taking place. But we suggest that this problem between the sort of international media focus and the triviality of a lot of what happens around G20 summits and the reality that it potentially performs this really crucial function could be overcome with a series of reforms. And the first one, and the most important one we suggest, is that it needs to now be properly institutionalized. It needs an executive. It needs a proper secretariat. It needs a secretary general, ideally somebody who's a former head of state or former head of government, who has the kind of level of respect from other heads of state to keep the show on the road a bit. Because the problem is it moves from country to country. Different countries have a serious agenda. Some countries have a more serious agenda than others, but quite often that agenda gets just derailed by, at least in the way it's presented in the media and the way it's presented in kind of everyday discussion. And I think, we suggest that a bit more institutionalization, modest institutionalization, but a bit more institutionalization could have quite a significant effect in both keeping the show on the road between summits, but also in terms of allowing for a more kind of considered, structured set of operations that bring together all the other work, great work that's going on under the surface in a more kind of considered way. We suggest in the paper that Singapore might be quite a good place for this, but obviously, and for a range of reasons, but obviously that would be something that would be part of the political conversations that would take place between different groups. The second reform we suggest is that the broad remit of the G20 should be widened dramatically. And it should be widened in the sense of moving beyond just international economic cooperation and the handful of issue areas where the G20 has taken a specific interest since 2008-9 to encompass kind of every area of globalization. We think the G20 should effectively become, in this sense, the overarching kind of monitoring, coordinating organization for every single area of globalization, particularly because part of that role will be about finding out and discovering and resolving where there are conflicts and pressure points and pinch points between different international agencies that have specific remits and so on. But then our third reform goes the other way and suggests that and we think this is the most crucial reform, is that the G20, at the same time of widening its broad remit for oversight, should then have an extremely narrow and highly focused view of what it can actually do better than any existing body. And that is simply to steer and coordinate. So the G20 shouldn't necessarily be a kind of policy development organization. It shouldn't be an organization that takes initiative in terms of determining, apart from the kind of the broad direction of travel that the political leaderships think should think the world should move in. Its job should be to resolve conflict and to resolve tension and to make sure that the work that is going on in different issue areas is both kind of upgraded where there isn't work going on. So when there are areas of the global political economy that are not adequately governed, that there isn't enough oversight, that the G20 begins to provide that. But at the same time, it should not be the organization charged with doing a lot of the very, kind of high level sort of work that the UN or the WTO or the IMF or others can obviously do better because of the amount of research capacity and so on that they generally have. The G20's role is to coordinate and to make sure that the globalization works better, essentially, and it's kind of seen to work better. So there are three kind of broad claims. We obviously go into a lot more detail about this in the paper, so if people want to read it, it's also available open access. I just thought I'd finish. I've just got a minute, if that's okay, Ali. I just thought I'd finish by saying how some of these insights have informed some of my work since. So I'm involved in two projects at the moment. One which hasn't got off the ground yet, but we put a grant funding bid in. So my colleague, Hugo Dobson, who some people might know, Hugo's very involved in some different T20 networks and so on. And we've just put a bid in with some colleagues from a university in Japan to hopefully do some work looking at British and Japanese kind of influence over different global governance bodies, in particular the G20, but also other spaces. And if we get that money, we'll be doing quite a lot of T20 policy briefs and things like that over the next 2 or 3 years. We're quite interested in how Japan and the UK are kind of a bit similar in terms of almost sort of being middle power countries that are fairly influential, but not super influential in the way the superpowers are, both grappling with rethinking their sort of place in their world. In Japan's case, as China becomes inordinately more powerful, in Britain's case, as it's chosen to withdraw from the EU. And then the other projects I'm involved in, we've just put a bid in. I've been doing some work with the Overseas Development Institute in London on how small island developing states experience kind of the fundamental changes that are happening, you know, kind of the return of great power politics, accelerating climate change, and kind of the collapse of the growth models that they depended on in the neoliberal era, especially tourism. So we've just put out quite a lengthy ODI working paper that looks at kind of rethinking global governance so that it can work better for small island developing states. So if anybody's interested in that, I can send it, or you can find it quite easily on the ODI website. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mishra. Thanks a lot for the presentation and offering critical perspectives on globalization in general and G20 in particular, and also offering recommendations for the future. Thank you so much. It would be great if you can share the link to your article in the chat section. People can have a look at it. So thanks a lot for that. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, and we'll take up those questions at the end after Dr. Alok Sheel speaks. So finally, I have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Alok Sheel to make his presentation, and he's going to talk in detail about the G20 and about the past as well as going forward. Dr. Alok Sheel is the RBI Chair Professor at ICRIER. He was a member of the Indian Administrative Services for 34 years between 1982 and 2016. During this time, he held several key positions in the Government of India as well as in the Kerala state government. In addition to holding positions in the rank of Secretary, he had multiple stints in the Treasury departments where he was responsible for budget formulation and management, as well as for interface with multilateral financial institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, and UNDP. He was also Secretary in the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and a senior multilateral interlocutor from the first G20 summit in Washington, D.C. in 2008 to the 7th one in Mexico in 2012. Professor Sheel set up and headed the G20 Secretariat in India. The Bishop you were referring to, the Secretariat, Dr. Alok Sheel set up the India Secretariat of the G20 in 2008, and he headed that secretariat also, and has led interdepartmental coordination for participation in various G20 work streams. He was also a part of the Prime Minister's delegation for several G20 summits. He has also diplomatic experience as an economic counselor in Washington and as the chair of the SAARC Development Fund in Bhutan. Dr. Sheel has published several articles in books and journals and is a regular commentator on economic issues in the print media. So over to you, Dr. Sheel, for a very detailed and extensive views on the G20. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ali, and a big hello to all my fellow participants, speakers, and those who are listening in. I have a presentation which I hope I can share. I think.
Do you want me to run it for you?
Yeah, I suppose so. You know, I'm a little
I'll do that.
Lost in that. I have it open here on my system, but I do not know how to bring it up.
No, I will do that. Is it fine? Is it visible?
I think maybe you have to select the presentation function, right?
I think is the PPT visible now?
Yeah, okay. Can others see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Oh, but I can't control it, right?
Yeah, I'll do. You can say next and I'll move it.
Okay. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is basically 5 broad areas. First is an overall background of the G20, its governance, why so much hopes have been pinned on it recently. Then secondly, I will look at, try and look at what the G20 interventions on COVID-19. And then I will move on to, you know, a big big overview of the status of the pandemic and vaccination. So, the kind of problems the G20 is really staring at when it meets at Rome. And then I try and see what might be a good outcome at the Rome summit. How do we assess, the outcome there? And finally, looking ahead at, if there is some time, looking ahead at the Indian presidency in 2023. Next, Ali, next slide. Okay. So the the background of the G20 is that it began at a finance ministers and central bank governors forum in 1999, I think, and then it was elevated to the summit level during the global financial crisis. And shortly thereafter, the G20 leaders declared that this was the premier forum for multilateral economic cooperation. So that had two implications. The first is that the G20 rather than the G7 would be leading the economic agenda, global economic agenda. But secondly, that in non-economic matters, the G20 would continue, the G7 would continue to be the premier forum. So although the rise of the G20 is attributed to the global financial crisis, it actually the rise has to be seen against the backdrop of the crisis of multilateralism during the preceding decade. Firstly, there was a decline in growth in the major advanced economies that had dominated the Bretton Woods institutions, and there was growth acceleration in the emerging markets, particularly in Asia. So this led to shifting economic weights, which meant that the active cooperation from major EMDs was required to address major crises and spillovers. And the proximate reason, as we all know, for the formation of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors forum was the Asian financial crisis, which was then subsequently elevated to leaders level at the time of the global financial crisis. And of late, there seems to be a weakening of multilateralism with the rising tide of nationalism, and also which has weakened the G20. And the other thing which is weakening the G20 is that the economic prospects of the emerging markets relative to advanced economies have somewhat diminished after the global financial crisis. And so this has led to a resurgence of the G7 relative to the G20. Next, Ali. Okay, so what has the G20 achieved to date? Very broadly speaking, it coordinated fiscal and monetary policies for macroeconomic stabilization following the crisis. And it played a role in keeping international trade open, at least in the initial years. And then as the threat of a second Great Depression receded, the G20 turned its attention to addressing the root causes of the crisis, which basically was a reform of global finance and a rebalancing of the global economy and to get growth back on track. And then as the global economy recovered, more items kept getting added to the G20 table. And its narrow focus, as the previous speaker referred to, that was lost. Climate change financing was one of the first items to come on the agenda. Then it made an attempt to try and accelerate the Doha round of trade negotiations. Development and infrastructure was added by Korea, these being largely developing country concerns. Then governance reforms of the financial institutions, international financial institutions, terror funding, corruption, coordination of tax policy, and several other items were added. And over time, the practice was adopted that in addition to this ongoing multi-year agenda, each chair would outline its own summit priorities. Next, Ali. So, what have been the priorities of the recent chairs? Saudi Arabia was the chair in 2020, empowering people, safeguarding the planet, and shaping new frontiers. That was its theme. But midway through the summit, midway through its presidency, the world was hit by the COVID pandemic. So health issues got prioritized midway in response to the pandemic. And managing the health and economic fallout from the pandemic is likely to shape the Italian and Indonesian presidencies as well. And this can be deduced from the priorities announced for the summits. Italy, people, planet, prosperity. Indonesia, recover together, recover stronger. And in 2023, we'll come to it at the end, what could India be looking at or should look at? Remains a question mark at this stage. We are still 2 years away from it. Next, Ali. So the G20, as as the previous speaker said, has no permanent secretariat, and having sat in on the G20 Sherpa meetings, I would say that this has been a conscious decision. This issue was discussed within the G20 by G20 Sherpas, at least in the initial stages, and they were very strongly of the view there should not be a permanent secretariat. That is something, why that was the thinking. We can always, discuss during the discussion if necessary. And the agenda setting and institutional continuity was provided through the Troika, comprising the previous, current, and next G20 chairs. And in practice, the current chair plays the active role with the other two members as sleeping partners. That has been my experience. And the first full cycle of G20 summits would be completed in 2025, when South Africa would chair the G20. And then the whole cycle would, resume. Next, Ali. So now what has the G20 intervened? How has it intervened in COVID-19? So as panic spread, Saudi Arabia, the extent chair, organized an extraordinary G20 Leaders Summit through video conference on March 26, 2020. And at this summit, the WHO and other organizations, they were tasked to assess gaps in pandemic preparedness and report to a joint meeting of finance and health ministers, that is G20 finance and health ministers, with a view to establish a global initiative on pandemic preparedness and the response. So this led to the emergence of the ACT Accelerator, that is Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, which is a platform for international collaboration involving governments and civil society, organizations launched by WHO, the European Commission, France, and the Gates Foundation in April 20. Then, because of the pandemic, the 15th G20 summit was a virtual one. The leaders could not meet face to face. And just shortly after the summit, COVID mortality, really peaked. And then in May 21 under the Italian presidency, the Global Health Summit was organized. And more recently, last week, in fact, the G20 health ministers met in Rome again. Next, Ali. Okay. Now, what were the outcomes of these meetings? So at the virtual summit on March 26th, the G20 leaders committed to injecting 5 trillion into the global economy as part of targeted fiscal policy, economic measures, and guarantee schemes to counteract the social, economic, and financial impacts of the pandemic. Then the virtual meeting of G20 finance ministers on April 7, 2021, they endorsed the new IMF general allocation of SDRs to assist the poorest countries. And according to the IMF assessment, the G20 countries have actually injected 9.5 trillion of direct fiscal support and an additional 6.3 trillion of liquidity support in response to the pandemic between January 20 and April 2021. Of course, 90% of the support was in the advanced economies. So it would seem that the G20 commitment in the virtual summit has been met. And then the IMF has also approved emergency loans totaling 116 billion to 85 developing countries, of which 60% was for the Western Hemisphere. And the Western Hemisphere has really been the worst affected region, as we will see. In addition, the World Bank Group has so far approved 150 billion to fight the health, economic, and social impacts of the pandemic, and an additional 4 billion in supporting vaccination efforts in poor countries. Next, Ali. Then the G20 set up a high-level independent panel on financing global commons for pandemic preparedness and response, and which submitted its report, a global deal for a pandemic. It submitted it to the G20 in June 2021. And according to this report, its recommendations are that 15 billion per year should be mobilized for effective pandemic prevention and preparedness. And as part of this, there should be a global health threats fund mobilizing 10 billion per year. That is 2/3 of the total. And this should be funded by national assessed contributions. The national health system should be made more resilient. And the mandate of the international financial institutions be expanded to include supply of global public goods, leveraging bilateral ODA and private philanthropy. And then supply of medical countermeasures and tools to radically shorten the response time to pandemics and to deliver equitable global access to vaccines. And establishing globally networked surveillance and research. Now, so after the this report was presented to the G20, the G20 finance ministers met in Venice on July 10, and they welcomed the report. Now, these are unique terms which the G20 communiques use: welcome, endorsed, which make a big difference. So welcoming means that it's still non-committal, and so it welcomed the report of the high-level panel and the commitments made at the Global Health Summit in the Rome Declaration. And then in June 2021, separately, the IMF, the World Bank, the WHO, and the WTO submitted a proposal inter alia to the G20. It's not exclusively to the G20. And in this, they have made their own recommendations. One is to vaccinate 40% of the global population by 2021 and 60% by June 2022. And if you look at the global data, which I will come to presently, the poorer countries, especially those in Africa, and even 4 G20 countries, Indonesia, India, Venezuela, South Africa, will struggle to meet this end 2021 target of vaccinating 40% of the population. That is fully vaccinating. Tracking and ensuring against downside risks, and ensuring adequate public health measures where vaccine coverage is low. And then based on the ACT accelerator, they have estimated that $50 billion are required to deal with the pandemic, of which 35 billion would come from public, private, and multilateral donors, and the balance by governments supported by concessional multilateral finance. Then a grant funding of 22 billion was identified by the accelerator, with 15 billion from COVID-19 financing facilities created by MDBs, an estimated gap of leaving an estimated gap of 13 billion in additional grant contributions needed to reach the 50 billion mark. And they also concluded that ending the pandemic in a timely manner is a global public good. And this funding proposal of 50 billion, it seems very large, is actually the highest return public investment ever. And benefits of 9 trillion would accrue through a faster end to the pandemic, and 1 trillion in additional tax revenues in advanced economies by 2025. So if you look at these 2 or 3 reports, there all sorts of figures are flying around. So I tried to put them together in a spreadsheet format of where the money is expected to come from, what is the gap. I do not know whether my interpretation or my assessment is accurate, and we can have a discussion. Some of my distinguished panelists would also have looked at these figures. The national assessed annual contribution to the threat fund would be 10 billion, and MDB's support to governments to reach this 10 plus private philanthropy would be another 5 billion per annum. So this would be the annual mobilization of 15 billion as recommended by the high level panel. And then the other report has suggested the MDBs facilitate another 15 billion. They say that 7 billion has already been identified, and that leaves a gap of 13 billion. So that adds up to 50 billion. Now, where are we on the pandemic today? So I've got in one spreadsheet, I've put together mortality over 6 weeks, mortality per million, every 6 weeks globally, and in 32 countries divided into 3 regions: Europe, Americas, and South and East Asia. And these countries account for 85% of total global COVID mortality and 70% of the population. So it gives you a rough indication of the course of the pandemic. So what do these figures show? Firstly, that global mortality, the official mortality, is around 4.6 billion. Million, 4.6 million to date. That is on the 6th of September. The third wave is still rampant. And these 3 waves show up clearly in the data in Western Europe and North America. And that, like the Spanish flu, the third wave is milder than the second wave. The waves are indistinct in South America. South America has very high mortality, but the data shows a sustained rise in mortality and a slow decline. And COVID mortality is distributed almost equally between North and South America, Europe, and Asia. Although deaths per million are far lower in Asia. Asia is a much higher population. And within South and East Asia, India and Indonesia are the worst performers. Mortality is very low in Africa, outside the areas adjoining the Mediterranean and South Africa. Next, Ali. And if we look at the vaccination data, you can see that these are the G20 countries put together and the major continents. So you will see, Africa has had, as on 29th August, only 4.8% had received vaccination, of which only about 2.4 were fully vaccinated. Similarly, South Africa, Venezuela, and India would struggle to meet the G20 target of 40% fully vaccinated person. Now, it says vaccinated. It is not clear whether it is fully vaccinated or partially vaccinated. So India would probably meet the target of 40% vaccinated, but it may be difficult to meet the fully vaccinated target. Indonesia likewise would struggle to meet both, so would Venezuela, South Africa, and Africa as a whole. So now coming on to against this background of where the pandemic stands and the G20 intervention so far, how do we look at the Rome summit? Italy will chair the summit to be held in Rome on October 30-31st. This is their, their theme, their priority: people, planet, prosperity, rebuilding differently. And previous speakers have spoken much about it. Well, issues, since the pandemic is still not over, issues associated with the pandemic are likely to be center stage. So would, probably climate-related issues, especially, there have been extreme climate events in all continents. So this would also is likely to be a major focus. Now, digital transformation of the economy is a focus area of the Italian presidency, and they have transformed the digital economy task force into a full-scale digital economy working group, which is indicative that they would be they'll have a major initiative in this area. And then after that, Indonesia will chair the G20 summit to be held in Bali, and its priorities are recover together, recover stronger. But it's too early to say from what is out in the public domain what Indonesia would be concentrating on, although the digital it has indicated that the digital agenda would be carried forward. So how can we assess the outcomes of the Rome summit? What would be a good outcome? Firstly, endorsing and forging a G20 consensus and operationalizing the reports of the high-level panel, the multilateral group, and commitments made in the Rome Declaration on pandemic response. Now, these documents and recommendations are already before the G20. And I think everybody will be seeing how the G20 acts on these recommendations. These reports and recommendations will address the short-term issues of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, such as healthcare, vaccine access, IPR waivers in technology transfer to poorer countries. They make recommendations how to make the world more resilient in responding to future pandemics, such as the Health Fund, the Global Health Threat Fund of 15 billion a year. They try and anticipate the economic recovery from COVID-19. They make recommendations on that. And if the G20 acts strongly, this would also address a long-standing criticism of the G20 that, like the former G7, its decisions are primarily address the problems of its member countries, and that it is not really concerned about, the poorer countries. And also, failure to act on these reports might underscore that the G20 is no longer capable of taking swift, strong, coordinated action in crisis as during the GFC in 2008-2009, because there already is a perception that it is no longer act in a position to take strong action, and its image has been further already damaged by its inability to forge a consensus on global vaccine patents during the pandemic at the WTO, despite the US backing of the proposal. Then there would be an action plan. Every summit comes out with an action plan developed by the working group on strong, sustainable and balanced growth. This could focus on commitments by G20 countries to provide adequate finance for completion of 2 doses of COVID-19 vaccines by a targeted date, address the problem of global hunger arising from the pandemic, and also aim to raise global growth, such as during the Brisbane summit, targets were set to raise global growth by, I think, 2%. So something similar could be attempted in the action plan at Rome. Then the COP26 is coming up in Glasgow in November 2021. And will the G20, agree to some more ambitious targets to limit warming to 1.5%, 1.5 degrees centigrade? I think that would be one area of focus. Then fiscal and monetary measures, the continuation, the exit from these measures, those could be, some sort of a general agreement on that could be on the table. And of course, the ongoing agenda on digitalization, taxation, anti-corruption, development, Bretton Woods, etc., would be there. Next. So now looking beyond Rome, you have the Indonesian presidency. And after that, you have the Indian chair coming up in 2023. Now, this is all very speculative. This is 2 years down the line. The government of India has still to, come out with what its agenda and priorities are going to be. There would be in-house discussions, going on this. So just looking at, the chair from the outside, from a think tank perspective, how can one look at it? So the ongoing agenda would be driven through established working groups, but India can introduce new themes and give new direction to extend themes. And what would determine this agenda? First is, what is the global environment? What would be the position on COVID? What will be the position on, is there some sort of a crisis, compelling action? Where are we on growth? So that would determine one of the determinants of the agenda. Then every chair also looks at the G20 from its own perspective, that what does it want from the G20? So India would also be asking that question, that how it can leverage the G20. And then the agenda also has to be sold to the wider G20 community for them to engage. And within the G20, there are 3 big players: US, China, and Germany. And it would be important for India to, get at least these 3 major countries engaged on its agenda. So if you look at the global economic environment today, and this is, some of these issues were discussed by the previous speakers. Global, the global spillovers are growing. At the time of the global financial crisis, when the G20 was looking at global spillovers, they were largely looking at economic and financial and fiscal. Since then, there has been a lot of spillovers from migration, from health-related issues like pandemics. Then on climate, there are a sense of urgency on climate. So how does the G20 handle these global spillovers within a framework of Westphalian sovereignty? So I think that's a big issue which the G20 needs to consider. And then there are these issues which have been highlighted after the global financial crisis, although these issues predate the global financial crisis, that the returns to capital were rising faster than returns to labor, so which led to issues of inequality, growing poverty. Productivity has been racing ahead of employment growth. You had jobless growth, youth unemployment, artificial intelligence. There have been growing concerns over inequality, old age poverty, youth unemployment. And then you have a demand constrained world with supply growing faster than demand, deglobalization and economic nationalism. Then what is the, some of the solutions which have been suggested, that you have a universal basic income. If so, how is it going to be financed? Will it be financed through a focus on inheritance taxes, on higher taxes on capital than on labor? And then the mainstreaming the role of civil society alongside that of the state. The G20 has been engaged with civil society, increasingly engaged with civil society organizations through various conferences, the T20, the Y20, the W20, and the foundations like the Gates Foundation. So increasingly non-state actors and foundations and transnational corporations are having a big impact on global governance and economic and other outcomes. So how do you mainstream them alongside the state within the global governance? These are the kind of issues which India could look at. And as far as India is concerned, what does it want from the G20? Or what can it contribute to G20? What are its own strengths? In the area of health, it can focus on intellectual property rights and vaccines during pandemics, considering that India is a global vaccine manufacturing hub. Traditional medicine has been suggested that India is strong in traditional medicine, but there are issues of standardized protocols which would need to be taken into account. Information technology, artificial intelligence, India has known strengths in this. So this is something it can bring to the table. As far as involvement of civil society is concerned, India has a very successful, a model, what is called a Langar model. It's a crisis response mechanism which has already harbored considerable international goodwill, and that can be leveraged to increase its soft power. And India is the co-chair along with Canada for the G20 framework for strong, sustainable and balanced growth, which has from the very beginning been one of its flagship working groups. And perhaps India could renew the focus on infrastructure, especially climate resistant infrastructure that should, I think, engage most countries. And it can have a significant impact through a New Delhi action plan. There are tricky areas where consensus has eluded the G20 in the past: climate change and trade. Because developing countries have in the past preferred to negotiate these through the UNFCCC and the WTO. And India's own stand on trade could come under greater scrutiny because of protectionist policies, and also, agreeing on ambitious targets on greenhouse emissions. India has, needs space to grow. So these are tricky areas for India. Finally, how can it engage the big three in the G20? Now, all developing countries would need to, when they chair the G20, real politics indicates that it must engage the big three on its agenda. And for this, it would have to delicately handle the US-China divide and differences between the EU and the US on the relationship with China. And especially since India is seen as overly hostile towards China and friendly towards the US. It could work closely with the EU and Russia to forge a consensus. And it could leverage the BRICS, of which it's a member, on Bretton Woods issues. And ideally, the Indian Sherpa should visit each G20 countries for exchange of views on the summit agenda priorities before finalizing the agenda, to ensure that all the G20 countries are sufficiently engaged on the agenda it brings to the table. So with that, over to you, Ali.
Thank you so much, Professor Sheen, for a very comprehensive presentation on the G20, what it has done so far, and what you expect India to take up, the issues India should take up. I'm sorry, we have very little time for question and answer session. If anybody has, one or two very focused questions, we'll be happy to take them up. In the chat section, if I see, we have there are lots of questions about what is the expected follow-up on the recommendations of this webinar. So we will have a policy brief following this webinar, and then eventually we'll come up with an edited volume before the close of this year. Yeah, I don't see any questions. So if anybody from the speakers has any questions, we can take it up quickly. Any comments or questions from the speakers? Otherwise, I would request Professor Rimmele to share any concluding remarks that he might have, and also to Deepak Mishra if you would like to say something before the end.
Dr. Mehdi, I'm happy to come in with just a remark.
Yeah, sure. Please.
Yeah, thanks. I would like to thank Dr. Giel for his presentation and talk, and all colleagues, of course, and want to hook onto the numbers of the recovery funds that you mentioned. The different amounts that were released in order to help recovery from COVID-19. And I mean, what strikes me with these numbers is that the difference between high-income economies, middle-income and low-income economies is not balanced out. Yeah, so we have on average 16% of the GDP in high-income economies invested into recovery programs, around 4% in middle-income economies, and around 1% in low-income economies. And you mentioned it as well, that there's a focus on a number of countries. So basically what we see is the risk that the difference simply in income generation and in economic strength will be structurally widened and also affirmed into the future. And I wonder what your thoughts are, because you reflected quite a bit on the G20, Now, Germany, of course, that I noticed you mentioned as one of the big three, where I, coming from Germany, would put a question mark, but I see where you're coming from. We are now challenged by reflecting on the G7 presidency. And obviously, G7 is in many ways even more problematic than the G20. And nevertheless, both fora, I think, need to sort of play ball with each other, and need to somehow find ways of strengthening each other. So I thought whether you could simply share some of your thoughts on how the G7 presidency of Germany can be used to tackle exactly that issue, that the COVID-19 crisis and the recovery that we observe is going to widen the gap. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. So yes, of the economic, of the stimulus, the financial stimulus, most of this has, of course, come in the advanced economies. And I think the assessment of, if you look at the IMF figures, it is 90% is actually in the advanced economies, which leaves a large section of the population, really struggling, because COVID has had a devastating impact. And that is why these reports, which are now before the G20 on nationally assessed global threat fund and MDB facilitated finance, and the gap which remains of this $50 billion proposal, that is expected to take care of this. So I would presume that most of this 50 billion would go outside the advanced economies. And so people would be looking to the G20, and that is one of the things which I tried to focus on, that are the G20 members just looking at themselves, they can take care of themselves, or are they looking at the wider economy, wider, the wider world of the poorer, the lower income countries in Africa. No African country is a member of the G20, except South Africa, of course. And one of the criticisms of the G20 has been that it has been largely dealing, in effect, been very self-centered. So yes, so that is an area of concern, and it would be, I think the Rome summit would be, I think, largely assessed on that. And already, it seems there is a perception that the G20 has failed on this, making vaccines, available, and adequate vaccines available to poorer countries, and also on the waiver of intellectual property rights on the manufacture. So, so that is one. And as far as Germany is concerned, that has been my observation within the G20. Not G20 alone, not Germany alone, but Germany as part of the European Union, the overall impact it has on the positions taken by the European Union. So Germany, I saw, was a major player, and especially under the leadership of Angela Merkel, it had played a very important role within the G20. Now, what the G20 presidency of the G7, really, I'm not familiar with the G7 process, except that the G20 process has been, my understanding, it has been modeled on the G7. I don't know, does the G7 have a secretariat? Because the G20 does not, and I think one of the reasons why it does not have a secretariat is that it was felt by the G20 Sherpas, and Sherpas represent the leaders, is that, once you have a secretariat, then everything goes into auto mode led by bureaucrats, like in the IMF, the World Bank, and the leaders stop engaging. The leaders engage when the secretariat is in their own office, which is what happens really to the G20 secretariat. It becomes part of the leader's office, and then they drive the agenda. And once the leaders drive the agenda, they can be impactful. The other thing, they can be impactful only by having a narrower focus. And after the first few summit, there was this soul searching in the G20 that our initial communiques were short, focused, and action was taken. And increasingly, they became a laundry list. Nobody even reads the whole communique. And what has been decided in previous G20 summits keeps getting added on, and new items keep getting added. So it has lost its focus. So it needs to, as one of the speakers pointed out, it needs to have a narrower focus on big issues. And now it is doing too much of micromanagement of other institutions like the Bretton Woods institutions. It's asking them to, they make the recommendation on behalf of the G20, G20 welcomes them and leaves it at that. So that is another test for the G20, whether the leaders are merely going to welcome these reports, or are they going to take actions, and how they're going to operationalize it. So the G7 of late, relative to the G20, I think has made a comeback, and people look at, I think, the G7 summits, which had been eclipsed for some time by the G20. I think they are back to being more impactful, especially after the change in the presidency in the US. In the US, for some time, under the Trump presidency, there was a sense that the cohesiveness of the G7 had declined. But under the Biden presidency, I think with the G7 can make impact. Of course, the G7 would be expected also to, assist this $50 billion proposal to be accepted by, the multilateral agencies and the major economies and the G20. I think that would be a major area. That and climate change, of course, with these things. And what do you do with things like inequality and artificial intelligence, unemployment, jobless growth? But that is things which even economists have struggled with.
I'm sorry, we have completely run out of time. So I would like to thank all the very distinguished speakers and participants of this webinar. I mean, 2 hours is never enough time to, to discuss and deliberate on these very important issues. But I'm glad that we had, a great discussion today on this theme. And I hope that going forward, we will keep rethinking differently and, come up with more ideas and, put it in front of leaders within the country as well as abroad for their kind consideration. So thank you all very much for your time and deliberations, and we look forward to interacting with you once again in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye.